The origins and motivations of the Colombian paramilitary groups, such as Muertes Secuestradores, MAS, that were supported by drug cartels U.S. corporations, Colombian politicians, and wealthy landowners to protect their economic interests and fight kidnapping. Colombia has been plagued by a long-running civil war between the government and various leftist guerrilla groups, such as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the National Liberation Army, ELN. These groups emerged in the 1960s and 1970s as a response to social and political exclusion, rural poverty, and state repression. They financed their activities through kidnapping, extortion, and drug trafficking. To counter the guerrilla threat, some sectors of the Colombian society resorted to forming paramilitary groups, which were armed and trained by the military, drug lords, and private actors. These groups claimed to defend the nation from communism and terrorism, but they also pursued their own agendas and interests, often in collusion with state officials and economic elites. One of the first paramilitary groups was Muertes Secuestradores, MAS, which means death to kidnappers. It was created in 1981 by the Medellin drug cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, to retaliate against the kidnappings of drug traffickers and their relatives by the M19 guerrilla group. MAS soon expanded its operations to target not only guerrillas, but also trade unionists, human rights activists, journalists, judges, and anyone suspected of being a leftist sympathizer. MAS also became involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. MAS was not a unified organization, but rather a loose network of local cells that operated with autonomy and flexibility. It received support from U.S. corporations that had interests in Colombia, such as Coca-Cola, Chiquita Brands, and Drummond Company. These corporations hired paramilitary groups to protect their assets and workers from guerrilla attacks and labor disputes. They also paid them to eliminate or intimidate community leaders, environmentalists, and land rights activists who opposed their operations or demanded fair compensation. MAS also had allies among Colombian politicians and wealthy landowners who saw the paramilitaries as a way to secure their power and privilege in a country marked by inequality and violence. They provided them with funding, weapons, intelligence, and legal protection. They also benefited from the paramilitary's campaign of terror and displacement that cleared large areas of land for agribusiness, mining, and oil exploration. MAS was one of the founding members of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, AUC, an umbrella organization that brought together several paramilitary groups. In the AUC became the most powerful and notorious paramilitary force in Colombia's history, responsible for thousands of massacres, assassinations, disappearances, tortures, rapes, and forced displacements. The AUC also controlled about 40% of Colombia's cocaine production and exportation. In 2003, under pressure from the international community and human rights groups, the Colombian government initiated a peace process with the AUC that resulted in the demobilization of more than 30,000 paramilitaries. However, this process was marred by impunity, corruption, and lack of justice for the victims. Many paramilitary leaders were extradited to the United States to face drug charges instead of human rights violations. Many others reorganized into new criminal bands that continue to operate in Colombia today. In this video, we will explore how the Colombian elite funded and supported death squads that terrorized the country for decades. We will focus on the testimonies of former paramilitary commanders, such as Salvatore Mancuso, who revealed how the right-wing death squads worked side by side with the country's business, military, and political elite to sow terror in the countryside and wipe out left-wing insurgencies. Salvatore Mancuso was one of the primary leaders of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, AUC, a coalition of right-wing paramilitary groups that formed in the Cordoba region in the north of the country to protect landowners from guerrillas, but rapidly expanded into one of the world's biggest drug cartels. Mancuso, who used the nom de guerre 000, was the AUC's second-in-command and orchestrated thousands of crimes and some of the darkest chapters in Colombian conflict, including massacres of unarmed civilians, torture, and sexual violence. Mancuso told Colombia's Peace Tribunal, known as the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, JP, that state institutions were not only complicit in the expansion of the AUC, but actively coordinated with them, giving orders to wipe out anyone suspected of aligning with communist rebels. This phenomenon of paramilitarism came from the state, Mancuso said on a video link from the U.S. where he was extradited on drugs charges, and Mancuso said officials gave the AUC lists of individuals and communities with suspected ties to the communist rebels so they could intimidate, torture, and assassinate them without consideration for the rules of war. These were assassinations, he said. There is no other word for it. Mancuso also admitted that his forces built crematoriums to burn the bodies of those killed or disposed of them in rivers to cover up their crimes. Mancuso's testimony also corroborated long-standing accusations that paramilitary groups planned their attacks in direct coordination with the Colombian government, as well as the private sector. Mancuso has claimed he worked directly with the Colombian army and police, as well as with the Administrative Security Department, DES, the country's disgraced former intelligence agency. Together with the paramilitary forces, those agencies coordinated kill lists, identifying individuals the government wanted silenced. Mancuso also named several prominent politicians, businessmen, and military officers who allegedly supported or benefited from the AUC's activities. He said that former President Álvaro Uribe, who is currently under house arrest for alleged witness tampering and fraud, was one of the main promoters of paramilitarism in Colombia. He also accused former President Andrés Pastrana of turning a blind eye to the AUC's atrocities and allowing them to operate freely in exchange for their support against the FARC guerrillas. Mancuso's revelations have sparked outrage and controversy in Colombia, where many victims are still waiting for justice and reparations. Some have questioned Mancuso's credibility and motives, while others have praised him for shedding light on the dark truth behind Colombia's conflict. Mancuso is seeking a reduced sentence from Colombia's transitional justice system in exchange for divulging his crimes. He was released from prison in 2020 and is currently under U.S. immigration custody. Colombia has requested his extradition, but his fate remains uncertain. In this video, we have seen how Salvatore Mancuso and other former paramilitary commanders have exposed how the Colombian elite backed and funded death squads that committed horrific crimes against humanity. We have also learned how these death squads work hand in glove with the state institutions to eliminate any opposition or dissent. This is a shocking and painful history that Colombia needs to confront and acknowledge if it wants to achieve lasting peace and reconciliation.